Do you believe that inexplicable things can happen in the most common situations? Well, let me tell you what happened to me. Hi, I'm Paulo, and I'm going to share something that I still can't fully understand. It was a night like any other. I had just gotten home after a long day at work. Those days when the only thing you want is to prepare something quick to eat and rest. I went straight to the kitchen, as I always do. I was chopping some vegetables when something caught my attention. Monotonous ticking. It just stopped. It was strange, because I had changed the batteries a few days ago. I kept looking at it, waiting for it to start working again, but nothing happened. I felt a sudden cold. It wasn't like the wind coming through an open window. It was a cold that seemed to come out of nowhere and envelop the entire kitchen. So I shrugged my shoulders and went to get the tomato sauce from the kitchen. Refrigerator. When I opened the door, I noticed that all the lights in the kitchen were flickering. They blinked 3 or 4 times before going out for good. I stood there, holding the refrigerator door, with the light inside it being the only thing illuminating the room. I took a deep breath and spoke out loud, as if to ward off the discomfort. Great, there goes the energy bill. But as soon as I finished speaking, the lights came on again, as if nothing had happened. What do you think that was? Just a power outage or something weirder? After the lights came back on, I tried to convince myself that it was just a wiring problem. After all, the house was already old, and small defects were common. I continued preparing my dinner, but the cold feeling persisted. It was strange, as if there was an icy current running through the kitchen, even with all the windows closed. As I stirred the pan, I heard something. It was a muffled sound, as if someone had lightly knocked on the kitchen wall. I stopped and remained silent, trying to identify where it was coming from. My first thought was that the neighbor was doing some renovations or something. That must be it, I muttered to myself, trying to reassure myself. I went back to the stove, but the sound returned, this time closer, as if it were coming from the floor. A dry, rhythmic knock, knock. It was so bright that I bent down to look under the sink, thinking maybe it was a pipe or something loose. But everything was normal. When I got up, I noticed that all the drawers in the closet were open, and it wasn't something I could have done without realizing it. I was sure the drawers were closed when I arrived. I stood still for a few seconds, my heart racing. Is this some kind of joke? I asked, looking around. I got the courage to close them one by one, but as I pushed the last drawer, all the others opened again at the same time, making a loud noise that echoed throughout the kitchen. I took a step back, feeling a mixture of fear and disbelief. That didn't make sense. There was no wind. There was no one there but me. Everything seemed too quiet now, like the entire kitchen was holding its breath along with me. After closing the drawers for the second time, I decided I needed a distraction. Finishing dinner seemed like the best idea, so I tried to ignore what had happened and focused on the food. But as I was chopping the vegetables again, the noise returned. This time, it wasn't just an isolated sound. It seemed like it was coming from every corner of the kitchen at once. I looked around and noticed something even more frightening. Utensils I had left on the counter started moving on their own. First there was a wooden spoon, which slowly slid down until it fell to the floor. Then, the rolling pin, which rotated slightly as if someone was pushing it. That's not possible, I whispered, feeling a lump in my throat. I thought maybe I was tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, the objects started moving more aggressively. A knife slipped from the counter and sank into the wooden floor with a sharp sound. A glass tipped over and broke, scattering pieces of glass everywhere. My instinct was to back away, but behind me was the sink. With nowhere to go, I stood there, trying to rationalize what was happening. I felt goosebumps all over my body when I saw the upper closet door start to slowly swing. as if someone was trying to open it. In an almost reflexive act, I shouted, "Who's there?" "That's not funny." My voice echoed through the kitchen, but there was no response. Just an oppressive silence. The closet door stopped swinging, but something fell out. It was a plate, which shattered on the floor with such force that pieces flew everywhere. It was at that moment that I realized it wasn't tiredness or imagination. Something was really wrong. My heart was beating so fast that it seemed to come out of my mouth. But at the same time, something inside me wanted to understand what was happening. After taking a few deep breaths, I tried to remain calm. Part of me wanted to drop everything and run away, but another part, perhaps curiosity or pure desperation, made me stay. I picked up a broom to pick up the pieces of the broken plate. While sweeping the floor, I noticed a different sound, almost imperceptible at first. It was like music, but distant, muffled, seeming to come from far away. The strangest thing is that it was familiar. I remembered that my grandfather used to listen to something similar on his old radio, a soft, nostalgic melody from a time that seemed to have been forgotten. The problem was that I didn't have a radio in the kitchen. The sound got a little louder, as if it was getting closer. I left the broom aside and tried to follow the source. It was as if the music was circulating through the kitchen, going from one corner to another. I walked slowly to the closet where I keep some old family things. When I opened it, the music suddenly stopped, leaving only heavy silence in the air. Inside the closet, I found something I didn't remember keeping there, a gold pocket watch. It was my grandfather's, and I was sure it was kept in a box in my room. I took the watch carefully and looked at it. It was still clocking 11:11. How did this get here? I asked, almost as if I expected an answer. As soon as I touched the clasp to open it, the lights started flashing again. The cold returned, even more intense, and I felt a slight ringing in my ears, as if the entire kitchen was vibrating. I looked around, holding the watch tightly. The feeling was that something was about to happen. Suddenly, a metallic sound echoed through the kitchen. It sounded like a clock ticking, but so loud it made the ground shake slightly. It didn't come from the pocket watch, but from all sides at once. The music returned, accompanied by the sound of ticking, creating an almost suffocating atmosphere. My heart beat at the same rhythm, accelerated and uneven. I needed to do something, but my hands were shaking so much I could barely think. Holding the pocket watch, I felt it was colder than it should have been, as if it had been left outside in the middle of winter. The sound of ticking around me seemed louder and louder, almost unbearable. I decided to try opening the watch again, but as soon as the clasp gave way, everything stopped at once. The silence that followed was almost as frightening as the sound. It was an absolute silence, the kind that makes your ears ring with emptiness. I stared at the open watch in my hand, but it didn't seem so harmless anymore. There was something about him that bothered me deeply. On the clock face, there were no numbers or hands, just a black surface, like a dark mirror, reflecting the kitchen ceiling. But when I tilted the object, I realized that the reflection didn't match the environment. Instead of the kitchen ceiling, I saw what looked like a long hallway, with walls covered in worn wallpaper and no source of light. I felt a chill run down my spine. I closed the watch quickly and placed it on the table, as if the act of putting it away could reduce the fear that was growing inside me. It was then that I heard another sound. Footsteps, slow and spaced out, as if someone was walking calmly, but not in the kitchen. The footsteps seemed to be coming from upstairs, directly above me. The thing is, my house doesn't have an upstairs. I looked at the ceiling, waiting, but nothing else happened. Just silence, again. I took the watch back, thinking maybe it was the center of it all. I needed to understand what was happening, but at the same time, Every fiber in my body told me to stop. This doesn't make sense, I whispered to myself. Suddenly, the watch began to vibrate slightly, as if it were alive. It made no sound, but the vibration was constant, almost mesmerizing. The kitchen seemed to fill with a different energy, something I couldn't explain, but it certainly wasn't natural. That's when something in the corner of my eye caught my attention. A quick, almost imperceptible movement. I looked towards the kitchen door and saw that it was slightly ajar, but I clearly remembered closing it. I stared at the half-open door, my breathing getting heavier. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, but the curiosity was unbearable. I grabbed a knife from the counter. I didn't know what I expected to find, but holding something made me feel a little safer. I walked slowly to the door. Each step seemed to echo in the kitchen, as if the floor amplified the sound of my footsteps. When it was a few centimeters away, I gently pushed it with the tip of the knife. The door slowly opened, revealing the dark corridor that led to the room. It was empty. The feeling of relief was momentary, as something still felt wrong. In the silence, I heard the pocket watch vibrating again, this time more intensely. I looked back at it, which was still on the kitchen table, and noticed that it was moving on its own, turning slightly, as if it were a compass pointer. Suddenly, he stopped. The watch cover opened by itself, and the black surface of the display glowed slightly. It was no ordinary glow. It seemed to pulse like a beating heart. Against my will, I was drawn to him. I approached slowly, feeling the air around me grow heavier, as if the entire kitchen was holding its breath. When I looked into the viewfinder, I saw the strange hallway again. But this time, it wasn't empty. There was something moving there, a shapeless shadow, sliding across the walls like an ink blot. I closed the watch tightly, almost hurting my fingers in the process, and threw it away. It hit the wall, falling to the floor with a thud, but it didn't break. Everything was quiet again, but I knew it wasn't over. It was then that I heard a creak. It was low but distinct, as if an ancient door was being opened. I turned to the hallway and saw that the door to the room, which had been closed before, was now wide open. The cold returned, more intense than ever, and it seemed to emanate from there. My mind screamed to run, but my legs were frozen in place. Everything in me said that the clock and that door were connected somehow. But how? I took courage and walked to the open door. Each step seemed to take me further away from reality, as if the very air around me changed texture, becoming heavy and oppressive. I reached the threshold and looked into the room. Nothing seemed out of place. The sofa was where it always was, the lamp on the side table, the curtains still. But the silence was unbearable. Not even the sound of the wind or the street entered. It was as if the world outside no longer existed. I took a step inside, feeling the cold increase. The ground beneath my feet felt different, as if I was stepping on something denser than wood. It was then that I realized the room was too dark. Even with the lamp on, it seemed like the light didn't reach the corners. And then I saw it. The pocket watch was there, right in the center of the coffee table. But how? I had thrown him in the kitchen. Approaching slowly, I observed the object, now still and without vibration. The lid was open again, showing the same black display. I felt something calling me to look inside it again. It was like an invisible pressure, pushing me forward. Against my will, I took the watch. When I looked at the viewfinder, the hallway scene came back. But this time it seemed more real, like it was happening in front of me. The hallway was brighter, and the shadow I had seen before was moving towards something. It was a door that looked very familiar. It was my kitchen door. The sight made me drop the watch, which fell to the floor, closing the lid with a loud click. At the same time, I heard footsteps again, They had been coming from the hallway, but now they seemed to be approaching quickly. I turned around, expecting to see something, but the hallway was empty. The only sound was my heavy breathing. I looked back at the clock on the floor. He began to spin in circles, slowly at first, but speeding up more and more, as if he were being controlled by an invisible force. Suddenly, he stopped, pointing directly at the room door that led to the hallway. The message was clear. Something wanted me to follow that path. It was as if I was being manipulated, guided by a force beyond my understanding. There was no longer any doubt in my mind. That watch was taking me somewhere. But where? Fear and curiosity were at war inside me, and for a moment I thought about just running away, never coming back. But something told me I couldn't run away, that if I didn't follow what was happening, something even worse would happen. I needed to understand what was behind it all, or at least find out what that watch wanted from me. I took a deep breath and, with heavy feet, walked through the living room door. The feeling of being watched intensified. Every step I took in the dark hallway seemed to echo like thunder, making my mind race, try to rationalize, try to find a logical explanation for everything. But there was no logic. With each step, the air became colder, and the environment denser. I could feel the presence of something, although I couldn't see it. Then, as he got closer to the door at the end of the hallway, the feeling intensified. It was as if something was waiting for me there. When I finally reached the door, it was ajar, just like the kitchen door before. I knew what I would do next, but I wasn't sure I was ready for it. With a shaking hand, I pushed the door and entered. The first thing I noticed was the light. It was no ordinary light. It was softly diffused, as if it were coming from all directions at once. And then I saw it. Whatever had guided me, there was not a physical presence, but a feeling. Something was there, watching me. It was as if the entire house had transformed, as if I were in another place, another dimension. I was back in my kitchen, but it wasn't the same. Everything seemed like a reflection, a distortion. The pocket watch was on the table again. The same clock that now seemed to beat like a living heart, stronger every second. And then the door behind me closed with a bang, leaving me trapped in that strange, cold space. When I looked at the window, there was no longer night, but a deep, dark void, as if the world had been erased. The clock continued to tick, but now there was something new. I couldn't stop looking at it. The shadows that had disappeared before began to return, now visible all around me, floating, formless but fully present. And time seemed to have stopped, or maybe I had been pulled into it. I no longer knew if this was real or an endless nightmare. The only sound I heard was the clock, which seemed to control everything, the sound of something that would never stop. And you? Would you be able to return to normal after all this? Or would you be stuck in this eternal cycle, like me?